Hello, class. Welcome back to Philosophy 1301. This is chapter 16, Feminist Philosophers. Finally, some really exciting stuff, at least in my perspective. Uh, so, feminism in general, it's really it's tremendous. It's both a movement and an approach to not just philosophical issues, but more to social and political and intellectual. It runs all the gamut throughout the whole gamut, right? It's sociological, it's political, it's philosophical, and it's also scientific. There's feminist philosophers of science and scientists. Um, so it's a complete reprogramming of the way that we've done intellectual uh, faculties. So feminists argue that inherently these traditional way of knowing is has certain biases, prejudices against women, namely that man is the I, so the knowing, the individual ego, whether it's the cogito, or whether it's whatever the extents, the less extents, the body, right? Whether it's the mind or the body, right? There's always that one universal I that's interchangeable, and that universal I, the standard of that I, right? The letter I, right? As in the ego, has been man. Man has been the standard of a knowing subject. Feminism argues that this is a bias, this is a prejudice, and it really, as a result of this prejudice, gives us an incomplete picture of reality. So feminism tries to, like I said, reprogram our view or our habit of categorizing that knowing subject as inherently a male subject. So feminists argue that these prejudices are common throughout society and academia. And what happens is that we discredit women's experiences, women's views, and women's ways of knowing and caring. So we just relegate women to a subordinate role. Right? This is what we call sexism, patriarchy. Feminist approaches can take a number of ways of levels and of expressions. There's different ways. There's different kinds of feminisms. There's like in history, we have what we call three waves of history, feminism, maybe even four waves now. But the first wave was in the 19th century, early 20th century, with Simone de Beauvoir, which we'll talk about right now. And this was more about equal voting rights, equal political rights, the first wave. The second wave was an extension of this first wave, and not just equal political rights, just such as voting and contractual rights, contract rights, making contracts with somebody else, legal contracts, but also social rights and human rights. Then the third wave of feminism is a reaction to first and second waves. Namely, is a reaction saying that this first and second waves are totally just emphasizing middle-class white women. Women of color and lesbians are left out of this equation of equality that these first and second wave of feminism are talking about. So, for example, the first wave is Mary Wollstonecraft, a really good example of that first wave. The second wave is Simone de Beauvoir. I know it's going to be upside down, but here's the book, Second Sex. Tremendous book, groundbreaking, totally reformulated the way we see the world. Second wave, the motto of the second wave of feminism is this: the personal is a political. And so there used to be a distinction between the public and the private realm. The public that's where things matter. The private is where you keep things private at the home, and that's where women was relegated, subordinated to the private realm. And this book here is called Personal Politics by Sarah Evans, and it kind of captures that whole spirit of making the personal the political, making the private sphere in that public sphere, that distinction, blurring that distinction. in saying that the private sphere of the woman is just as political as the public sphere of men in doing debates and in Congress and stuff. It's just as important for life. So that's the second wave. And then you have writers such as Angela Davis, who used to be a Black Panther activist, was jailed, was exiled, because supposedly she was accessory to murder. She's a badass, basically. She wrote this book, Woman, Race, and Class. Tremendous little book. I actually had the privilege of meeting her, and she signed this book. Angela Davis signature. So pretty proud of this. And what she's saying is that she's third wave feminism. It's a reaction against this second wave emphasis of white middle class women. She's saying that African American women have a particular different historical experience than white women. So we cannot expect or how can I put the same remedies or prescriptions that you're giving us, Sarah Evans, for example, or Simone de Beauvoir, to the experience of Black women. Namely, Black women have experienced the historical tragedy of slavery. So she begins with that. Slavery and how that experience makes African American unique, right? And they have a certain distinct oppression as opposed to white women, just on the basis of history there, of slavery. Then she talks about the use of rape back in slavery and how that also configures present day experiences for African women. And not in a negative way. Of course, rape is terrible, right? She says that. But this experience of rape made African women so resilient and so powerful as she is today. That's one of her main arguments in this book. Let me read you some of these quotes here that I think are kind of powerful here. Black women were women indeed, but their experiences during slavery, hard work with their man, equality within the family, resistance, floggings, and rape had encouraged them to develop certain personality traits which set them apart from most white women. And I'll continue on. He says, these black women were driven to defend their children by their passionate abhorrence of slavery. The source of their strength was not some mystical power attached to motherhood, but rather their concrete experiences as slaves. Right, so these people here, right, in the first wave, we're all saying that this motherhood has a certain kind of power, and thus we should be equal for men. There's this mystical power of motherhood, and Angela Davis is like, yeah, African women. Besides that, just the concrete experience of slavery had made them unique, and thus they have unique experiences of oppression today, as compared to white women. Thus, the great work that you're doing in second wave feminism, that's great, but doesn't correspond to African women or women of color. And that's the third wave feminism. So I'll just finish this last quote of her introduction for this book, Angela Davis. It's called Woman, Race, and Class. Just intersectionality, it's called. Just intersections of different axes of oppression. Right? Being a woman, you're already oppressed there. Being black, right? Doubly oppressed. And then being poor, your class, then you're triply oppressed. Right? All these different intersections of oppression, making you a unique identity as compared to the white middle class woman. So she says, it was those women, right, these African American women, the slave women, who passed on to the nominally free female descendants a legacy of hard work, perseverance, and self-reliance, a legacy of tenacity, resistance, and insistence on sexual equality. In short, a legacy spelling out standards for a new womanhood. Yeah, so woman, race, and class. Absolutely powerful little book. According to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover during the 1960s, late early 70s, she was considered one of the most important threats to the internal security of our nation, the Black Panther Party. She was a founder or a leader of the Black Panther Party. Angela Davis. She came to El Paso a couple of years ago. It's kind of cool. She's still around. She teaches at California Irvine, I think. University of California Irvine. Teaches philosophy and liberation studies. Another example of the third wave feminism that I think is more pertinent to most students in our classes here at El Paso College is Gloria Saldúa. Oh, I just lost the page. Borderlands, La Frontera, The New Mestiza. I know it's upside down, but whatever. There's also kind of in the same vein as Angela Davis. Instead of slavery, she has this different Chicana identity. And that identity as a Chicana has both external oppression and internal oppression, meaning that you're being oppressed not just by the state for being brown, right? Border Patrol, for example, or ICE, but you're also being oppressed internally with your own people for being a woman, for being a Chicana. And you got to break away from that. It's the new mestiza, the new borderlands. This is the borderlands that this identity has to transcend between the interstices, intersticios, as she says, the in-between space of this stuff. I was going to show you some quotes here. I forgot. I just missed the. I'll find it right away. Here it is. And it's in a subsection that she calls intimate terrorism, life in the borderlands. So this borderlands, not just like the international border between the U.S. and Mexico. So she was raised in South Texas, the border over there, in the valley of Texas. But border between sexualities and stuff. She was a lesbian, and she was open about it. Very open about her lesbian identity back in the 70s and 80s, which is extremely radical back then. So let me just read you a little excerpt from this Borderlands, the New Mestiza. Alienated from her mother culture, alien, quote unquote, in the dominant culture, the woman of color does not feel safe within the inner life of herself. Petrified, she can't respond. Her face caught between those intersticios, the spaces between the different worlds she inhabits. The ability to respond is what is meant by responsibility. Yet, our cultures take away our ability to act, shackle us in the name of protection. Blocked, immobilized, we can't move forward, we can't move backwards. The reeling serpent movement, the very movement of life, swifter than lightning, frozen. We do not engage fully, we do not make full sense of faculties, we abnegate. And there in front of us is the crossroads in choice. To feel a victim where someone else is in control, therefore responsible and to blame. Being a victim and transferring the blame on culture, mother, father, ex-lover, friend, absolves me of responsibility. Or feel strong, for the most part, in control. My Chicana identity is grounded in the Indian woman's history of resistance. So that's the third wave movement that's going on during the 80s, 90s. Like I said, as a response to the first and second wave movements, as excluding these experiences, these unique experiences, right, of color. And now we're moving into a so-called fourth wave of feminism, or post-wave, which includes now transsexual people, right? The LGBTQ, right? Queers, transsexual, non-binary, and all that other new identities that should be protected and given equal rights and stuff. So you have writers like Judith Butler, for example. Who else I'm thinking about? Just one of the main ones here. But we have different waves, and they're all responding to present-day political, social issues. And it's our response to the sexual differences and this privileging of patriarchy. Okay? So let's go over what the textbook says. Let's go, just like the historical trajectory of these different waves via this different figures. The first one we talk about is Mary Wollstonecraft. She was born in 1759, died in 77. And basically, her most famous book is The Vindication of the Rights of Women. That was published in 1792. And in this one, she lays out how women have been subordinated since time immemorial, right? That women exist for the sake of men, basically. That women are denied property, they're denied ownership, they're denied anything. Everything is due. A woman wants to do everything, or everything a woman does or is a reflection or a projection of males' expectations. So a woman exists for the sake of men. And she lays that out, how and why. And she says it's education. We're not given equal education. If we educate women, that's a remedy, education. Give women equal education, and we'll remedy, we'll hone in her virtues, and she'll make a perfect companion, a rational companion for the rational being, men. That rational I. Right? So we need to educate women so that men could have an equal, rational partner, and thus a better world. That's basically Mary Wollstonecraft. So there are three main pillars where we need to educate women or be equal between the sexes. Equality is in reason, on virtue, and knowledge. These three pillars are the three main pillars of Wollstonecraft's thought. That has to be equal. We have this false system of education that makes these things unequal. Reason, virtue, and knowledge. They are kept in ignorance just for the sake of men's pleasure and expectations. And she calls out on all these philosophers, Aristotle, Rousseau, a bunch of other philosophers that talk about women in such terms, such degraded terms. The next figure we'll talk about is Simone de Beauvoir. And this is the woman that wrote The Second Sex, over here. It's a French woman. She was a long life partner of Jean-Paul Sartre. We talked about him. She's an existentialist as well. She went with school with him. They studied together, and they pretty much were lovers. And although they never married because they didn't believe in that bourgeoisie institution of marriage, they were nonetheless partners. They each had their own lovers as well. And it was crazy. There's a collection of letters between Sartre and de Beauvoir. And Sartre, poor guy, he's like, I understand, you have this guy over there with you, and he's awesome, and yeah, I want to meet him too. But right now I'm in America, I'm teaching, and miss you. And Beauvoir answers yeah, this guy, Pierre, is hot. It's amazing in bed. She's very honest about it, right? And they're really open on the relationship, completely open, pretty radical for this time period, which was the 60s, 50s, and 60s. Right, so I don't know. There's that about them. They were married. I mean, they were not married. They were buried together at Montparnasse cemetery, where a lot of other famous people are buried there too. So if you're in Paris, take a trip to Montparnasse cemetery. All right. So yeah, she wrote The Second Sex. So what is in this book here? It's pretty thick. It's a lot of about 700 pages or so. So she starts off with this main question of what is a woman? What is a woman? What is a woman? And she, to clarify this question, she makes a distinction between the biological category and the sociological category that makes womanhood, that makes a woman a woman. Right? So there's the female biological, just fact, of biology, and then there's a sociological, social construct of woman. So there's a female genitals and stuff, right? That's just a fact of nature, you want to call that, or biology. She actually calls it just biology. There's differences, biological differences. But on top of that, right, that really controls what's going on in society is these institutions that gender is learned. That it's not the same as a biological fact. That gender, woman, man, is something you learn, you condition. It's a social condition. You're socially conditioned to become a woman by adopting and learning certain characteristics and certain traits and certain skills and certain habits, etc., so on and so forth, right? So she quotes, says, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. You are born female or male, but you become a woman. It's a becoming process of becoming, right? It's existentialism 101 here, applied to the female question, right? It's feminism again. All right. Existence precedes essence. Your essence, you determine that, right? Whether you're womanhood here, right? Just substitute essence for woman, right? You exist first, and then you become a woman. This is taking the same formula as Sartre's existentialism, but she's applying it to this issue of sexual inequalities. So the second sex, this was published in 1949. Fucking radical at this time period. People still think that her thought is too radical for us, right? Another important concept that she brings up, besides this distinction between the biological and the sociological constructs of gender, is the concept of the other. Right? That woman here is considered the other. So there's the one, the I, the eternal I, which is going to be the male perspective, and then the other. And she claims that for even anthropologists like Herbert Mead, old school anthropologists from the 1920s, realized that people, primeval people, or just a primal instinctual, the way we create identities, the way I know that I exist, is by either looking in the mirror and realizing that's me somehow, or more easily by looking at someone else looking at me back and being like, oh, okay, I am me, you are you. And that's how we get an impression of difference of me, myself. And she says that this is what happens here. But that I is the male, and the other is always going to be the female. So throughout history, the male human has been thought of as the epitome of humans, as the embodiment of humanity is, right, mankind. Right? Think about that word, mankind. Because that's mankind, right? It's humanity. We mean humanity. We mean all humans when we say mankind, but we're using the word, that gendered word, man, because we historically, traditionally, the standard has been that the epitome, the embodiment of all humanity, is in the body, in the vision, in the image of the male. Right? The woman, right, has been cast as the other, right? A creature that's defined in relation to the one, to the male. She is other than that. She's otherwise. And men are primary, women are secondary. Right? Just picking up on where Wollstonecraft left off at here. That's what Simone de Beauvoir is doing. So, quote unquote, she says, humanity is male and man defines woman not in herself, but in relation to himself. She is not considered an autonomous being. Woman, the relative being, writes Michelet. She is the other. He is the subject. He is the absolute. She is the other. All right. So, how do we get away from this oppression? How do we get away from this patriarchal mode of thinking and of categorizing and seeing the world? It's about just real freedom, something she says. Reciprocity. To realize that women have the same faculties, same abilities as men. Different biological, just different biology, right? Obvious biological differences. But besides that, nothing else is different, really. Okay. So true equality of both men and women. So equality in education, like Mary Wollstonecraft said, that's right. But also inequality in working conditions and salaries, sexuality, marriage, motherhood, the care of children, and a whole lot more. Everything that makes life. Everything should be equal. Real freedom. That's real freedom for both men and women. So we have to have we just don't have to give women just equal rights. It's got to be this whole deeper transformation of society, basically. This whole revolution of society is got to be transformed to make things real equally among the sexes. All right, so that's basically we'll talk about Mary Wollstonecraft, or her and Simone de Beauvoir. So let's move on to the ethics of feminism, feminist ethics, and feminist epistemology. I'll talk about that very quickly. So most of ethics, traditional ethics, has been all about being impartial, right? About justice. Uh, what other words can we use? Virtue, right? I guess virtue is for both, but right, justice, being impartial, universality. Think about Kant here. I think Kant is a perfect example of this traditional view of ethics. Right, we've got to find a theory, ethical theory, or way of life, morality, that is universal, uh, that is impartial, and that's about justice, subjective justice out there, right? It's kind of abstract stuff, right? And it could be applied equal to everybody. Right? Categorical imperative. You gotta do your duty, right? So universality, right? Treat others as ends in themselves and not as means. And this is for everybody. It doesn't care about your feelings, doesn't care about your intentions or anything. You just gotta do your duty. Right? This is Kantian ethics. As ethics, on the other hand, downplays this role of these moral universal principles, these traditional ethical concepts, right? And ethical theories insist instead that moral reflection, that our moral duties, must take into account social realities, social practices, relationships between people, between families, kith and kin, between institutions, and power arrangements. We have to take into account the reality of our society. Principles that have been traditionally associated with Western ethical thought, from Aristotle to Mills to even Kant. Right? Doesn't matter what kind of ethical theory we've talked about, basically, so thus far. Right? They're all about autonomy. Right? Autonomy. You're gonna be autonomous. Decide for yourself. Utility. Right? Utilitarianism. Is it good? What's the results? What's the consequences of these actions? Right? Freedom. Right? Equality. Right? These big moral principles. Right? These are too broad, too abstract to really help us out, especially for the specific, unique entities that women experience, whether it's the second wave or third wave, as we talked about earlier. Right? You just can't just put a big band-aid for everything, basically. So these feminist writers, feminist ethicists, right, they argue, right, and I think correctly, that these values and virtues that are inherent in most of these traditional moral theories, right, autonomy, utility, freedom, reflect the masculine perspective. These are things that males already have: autonomy, freedom, utility, equality. Women don't even have that yet, right? So that's what this feminist ethics thrust is trying to remedy. It's a corrective. So let me quote Alison Jagger, who was one of the pioneers of this uh, ethics of parenting. There's a video of her uploaded in this module or this file, this chapter on Blackboard. Should be below this lecture link. So she says, supposedly masculine or male associated values of independence, autonomy, intellect, will, wariness, hierarchy, domination, culture, transcendence, product, asceticism, war, and death over the supposedly feminine or female associated values of interdependence, community, connection, sharing, emotion, body, trust, absence of hierarchy, nature, immanence, process, joy, peace, and life. Right, so there's two different perspectives of seeing, of engaging with the world. Alexander Jagger says that males engage the world via these values: like independence, autonomy, intellect, will, whatever I just said, right? And females use more of this interdependence instead of autonomy, community instead of uh, independence, connection instead of hierarchies, right? So two different ways of engaging with the world, thus it's going to produce two different ways of viewing morality. So the ethics of care. This is a moral perspective that emphasizes these unique demands of our social realities. These specific situations that demand specific demands, specific duties. Uh, and something that we need to account as the ethics of care principle is feelings and emotions. Feelings and emotions don't come into play in traditional uh, theories of ethics. So, an ethics of care shifts the focus to the unique demands of specific situations and to the virtues and feelings that are central to close personal relationships. So, empathy, compassion, love, sympathy, and fidelity. These feelings, these processes, don't are not taken into account or dismissed. Ethics of care is like, no, these are central to our everyday reality, and thus we need to take into account these things. All right. So caring is an essential part of morality, and the most influential theories have not fully taken into account this process, this phenomenon of caring. And thus, we can never be impartial, really, truly impartial or objective, because I have a more direct and more urgent, I guess, relationship with, say, my brother or sister than with a stranger. If I see a stranger drowning and right next door I see my brother drowning, I'm going to say my brother, just because of this phenomenon of caring. Right? And most of these ethical theories thus far don't take into account or dismiss this process of caring. That's why this is called ethics of care. So let's talk about now feminist epistemology, feminist ways of knowing. Right? Um, so feminist epistemology has this premise, uh, which I adopt as well. I think is correct, my own perspective as well, that when we know something, when we have knowledge, there's two processes going on, two phenomenon going on. Right? There's the situated knower. There's me, the knower, but I'm situated somewhere. Right? I'm in El Paso, for example, right now. It's 2020, middle of a fucking pandemic. Right? And there's a situation, there's circumstances, there's a context around the knower, around me, the knower, or you who is knowing something, there's learning something right now. You have a certain social economic, there's race, there's class, there's socioeconomic status, there's gender, there's all this stuff happening, right? That's unique to you, right? So there's that. Each knower is situated in the world somehow with different configurations. It's not just one knower that could be universal, right? A cogito ergo sum, right? The cogito from Descartes, for example. No, each cogito is its own unique cogito. Each knower is unique. It's situated. Right? So the situated knower, there's that in epistemology, the feminist epistemology, and then there's situated knowledge. The knowledge we gain is also situated. It's also based upon certain historical and sociological uh, trajectories that are unique to a specific piece of knowledge you're gaining. So I'm giving you knowledge that is unique to the way I was raised as well, the way I would learn this stuff, the way that the community college provides guidelines to teach. For example, if you take the same class, Intro to Philosophy, say in China or in the Middle East, it's going to be quite different from what I teach you, the concepts. There'll be a lot of overlapping, right? The same kind of subjects and topics, but the knowledge that you're going to gain is going to be quite different, just because that knowledge that's given to you is situated as well, has its own also historical and sociological context, social historical context, right? It's not knowledge is just not abstract and pure, right? It's like tainted by history, is society. So situated knower, situated knowledge. Okay. So how knowledge arises from the unique perspective, practices of those involved knowing, from my own perspective, my own, right? That has to be taken into account. And how knowledge is developed, right, in certain contexts, right? So it's all about context here, right? Feminism, the big emphasis is context. Check the context, where you come from. Check your positionality. What is your position? What is your intersections? What is your race? What is your gender? What is your sexuality? What is your class? And that will give you a unique way to look at the world, right? And you just can't place that perspective, right? What you think is right, you just can't put that on anybody else. Right? It's just particular circumstances that make individual experiences particular. Right? And this is what feminism, whether it's ethics or whether it's epistemology, tries to focus on. Right? The social realities at hand. There are sort of alternatives of different epistemologies, feminist epistemologies. For example, there's a feminist empiricism, there's a feminist endpoint theory, and there's a feminist postmodernism. Feminist empiricism is the least controversial. Basically, it's just saying that it takes basically, it doesn't want it to transform anything at all. It's just saying that it takes an empirical remedy, right? The basis of all science is empirical evidence, is empiricism, it is observation. What's going on though is that most of these scientists are male and are looking at the world in that one male perspective. So what we got to do is expand this observational skill, faculty that humans have by, I guess, adding the female perspective as well. Right. So it calls for a deeper, more rigorous application of empiricism. Like, the feminist empiricist maintains that philosophers and scientists need to be told to look again rather than to find a wholly new way of looking. Right? So you're not trying to revolutionize and transform the way of, just look again. You're just missing some stuff. You're going to be more deeper and rigorous in our observations. It's the female standpoint, right? The female perspective that's kind of missing here. That's feminist empiricism. Then the feminist point theory. This one is it's what I was saying about situated knowledge, situated knowledge, basically, right? That different social groups have distinctive ways or kinds of knowledge acquired through unique experiences. And a big deal about the feminist standpoint theory is that some situated knowers and situated knowledges have privilege than others. So going to school here in the United States, it's a commodity. It's a privilege as compared to going to school in Gambia or Ghana, right, where they might not even have textbooks or air conditioners or even windows. And we have here laptops and shit. Right? So, right, there's different privileges on the epistemologies, right? So there's what we call epistemic injustice that happens, right? Then we forget that we have this position of privilege, and we try to apply our way of knowing to other people that don't have our privilege as well. Right? Called epistemic injustice. Right? So injustice is not just done by like physically, but we could do it intellectually, right? Epistemically, right? Different people have different ways of knowing, and this is most perfectly seen between the epistemic injustice between males epistemology, the way of knowing traditionally, and the female epistemology, right? We tend to say that males are more objective and more rational than the females that are consumed by feelings and stuff, right? It's a perfect example of this epistemic injustice. Both perspectives are equally as good as giving us a good analysis of the world. And in fact, we should probably incorporate both of them. Right? But we're still not there yet. Right? And this is what feminist philosophers and philosophy is all about. To get us there. To have a more complete picture of what's going on. All right. The next one is the postmodernist feminist. This is perhaps the most radical one and the most controversial one. So they distrust or reject some of the basically all foundations of epistemological ideas or ideas of modernity. So objectivity or scientific truth, or objective reality or facts, right, are questioned. Universal propositions are distrusted or questioned or rejected. Foundational knowledge, right, ultimate justifications, traditional conceptions of rationality, all these, right, traditional forms of knowing are just questioned, right? It's a ongoing process of critique, postmodernism, right? It shatters the static and illuminates that everything is fluid, everything is constantly just changing, and nothing's just fixed, including not just our identity, but our ways of knowing, and it goes, it just breaks through what we think we know, postmodernism. Right? It deconstructs basically what we think we know. Everybody, deconstruction is a particular way of method of pretty much analyzing very carefully the signs and symbols and language that we use in writing to uncover the inequalities and hierarchies embedded within our writing. Right? So think about the standpoint feminist epistemologies. All right. So feminist postmodernists refuse to accept a basic tenet of this feminist standpoint theory, that there can be a single privileged perspective from which to acquire knowledge. So the feminist standpoint theory argues, or some of them argue, that because females have to work more, have to negotiate and transcend between different characters, namely the private and the public. So they got to be a mother, they got to be caring, and also when they go to work out in the public, they got to be professional, they got to be objective, they got to be, and thus their perspective is a better perspective. It's more broad and more thorough Then a male perspective, it just has to do one thing, right? One identity, right? It doesn't have to negotiate between these two realms. The male has that privilege. The female doesn't. And for feminist standpoint theories, some of them argue, thus the feminist standpoint is the better perspective. Postmodernism is like, no, none of it. No perspective is better. It's just chaotic, basically. Right? You can't say something's better. There is no standard, right? That standard is just broken away with. This is what postmodernism does. It breaks away with any kind of standard. So there's no way to pinpoint or to use a measuring stick, right? Because there's no foundation. No foundation in postmodernism. It's just constantly just ever changing. Things are ever flowing. Things are always popping in and out of existence. Stuff. It's a very radical way of looking at the world. So postmodernism or postmodernist feminists insist on the existence of countless perspectives, a plurality of viewpoints, but none able to claim any epistemological advantage over others. None can be called objectively true because there is no perspective neutral standard by which to judge objective truth. And does this mean it's just going to be anarchy? So everything goes? No. The postmodernists, no, they don't say that. They say, you know what? What's going on though? What legitimizes a perspective, right? But justifies a perspective, not as true, but just gives it legitimacy, is what they call localized practices. The context again, right? The specific context of localized practices that makes one perspective fit or the other. For example, I was reading this book about this indigenous kid, a male guy, this little boy, that was born and raised in Chiapas, down in Mexico, in the jungle, right? Indigenous. Didn't even know Spanish. And then he was really bright in a really local village, right? And so he was well off, right? He was well off indigenous people. Uh, his father had land there, and they moved him to Mexico City to go study philosophy, of all things, right? Uh, and when he first got there, right, he did terrible in school because he was learning Shakespeare, right? Well, he learned Shakespeare, he learned all these things that we're learning right now, Aristotle, and he did terrible because he was used to back in life, right? So he did terrible in school, and then he goes back, right, in summer vacation, I guess, school's over. He goes back to his family, to the village, and he's terrible there too. He doesn't know how to fucking plant no more, right? Because so he's been so enmeshed trying to figure out Shakespeare and Aristotle that he forgot what's useful in the localized practices in his local village, right? So not only he felt useless in both fucking worlds. He's like, "Fuck, what I do?" Right? You just lost. So this is what postmodernism is. Like, what is your identity fixed, right? It depends on where you're at, right? In the village, right, you need to know how to plant. You need to learn how to survive in the jungle on your own. Shakespeare is not going to help you to survive in the jungle. Might keep you busy for maybe 30 minutes or so, right? But to find food in the jungle, or if you didn't buy a snake in the jungle, are you going to bust out a book of Shakespeare? No, right? You're going to need some medicine, some traditional medicine, so you guys know something, localized practices. But once you go to the university setting, in Mexico City, right, UNAM, as this kid went, for example, that other knowledge he had here is kind of useless. Now he needs to know Shakespeare. Now he needs to know analyze meters and rhyme and stuff like that. That over here doesn't matter, right? It depends on the locality, localized practices. This is what postmodernism says. We cannot have one standard view across different localities because each local society, context has different needs and different applications and stuff. So epistemic pluralism is what they're trying to get at. All right, so that's pretty much it. This is the chapter of feminist ethics. I know this is already finals week, okay, so guys, I hope you guys are just catching up on all the work. I'm going to upload just one more chapter, chapter 17, the contemporary period, just because some of those concepts are in the final exam, and it should be a really, really short video. So if you have the time, please check out the next one as well. But yeah, well, thank you so much.